The story of Alexander the Great is a tale of relentless ambition, brilliant strategy, and the willpower of a man who never lost a battle. From the moment he inherited the throne of Macedon at just 20 years old, Alexander set out not only to defend his kingdom, but to conquer the world. His army, though small compared to the vast empires he faced, was molded into a disciplined, innovative force that could shatter any formation and adapt to any terrain. Every campaign he embarked on became a testament to his genius and his refusal to accept defeat. The first great test came against the Persian Empire, the most powerful force of the age. At the Battle of Granicus, he faced a Persian army that outnumbered his own. The Persians believed they could overwhelm him by sheer numbers, but Alexander's cavalry charge broke through their ranks with speed and precision. He led from the front, striking fear into the enemy and inspiring his men to fight beyond exhaustion. Victory there opened the gateway into Asia Minor and set the tone for what was to come. At Issus, he faced Darius III, king of Persia, commanding a massive host far greater in size. The Persians stretched across the plains, their sheer number intimidating. Yet Alexander understood that battles were not won by numbers alone, but by exploiting weaknesses. He directed his forces toward the Persian center where Darius stood, creating panic in the heart of the enemy. The Persian king fled, abandoning his soldiers, and the Macedonian phalanx cut down those left behind. In one decisive strike, Alexander proved that even the mightiest kings could be humbled. The confrontation at Gaugamela was perhaps his greatest triumph. Darius gathered an army so large that it stretched beyond the horizon. Chariots with scythes, war elephants, and endless infantry formed a wall of power. Yet Alexander was not intimidated. He studied the battlefield, adjusted his formations, and lured the Persians into disorder. When the moment came, he drove his cavalry wedge straight toward Darius once again. The Persian army collapsed, and the empire that had stood for centuries crumbled before him. But Alexander's victories were not limited to open plains. In sieges, he was equally relentless. At Tyre, a city fortified by the sea, he constructed a massive causeway and brought siege engines to bear against walls once thought unbreachable. The defenders fought fiercely, but Alexander's determination was unstoppable. After months of relentless assault, the city fell, proving that no fortress could withstand his resolve. Even in the deserts of Egypt and the mountains of India, he adapted his tactics to the land and the enemy. At Hydaspes, he faced King Porus, whose war elephants thundered across the battlefield. To his men, the sight was terrifying, but Alexander countered with precision, surrounding the beasts and striking their riders until the elephants themselves turned in chaos against their own lines. Well, Porus was defeated, yet treated with honor, showing Alexander's blend of ruthlessness and respect for worthy opponents. Alexander the Great never fought for defense alone. Every battle was a step toward empire, every victory a stone, laid in his vision of a world united under his command. He understood how to inspire loyalty, how to strike fear, and how to seize opportunity in the heat of war. His record of never losing a battle was not only the product of skill and courage, but also of an unshakable belief that he was destined for greatness. His campaigns reshaped the ancient world, and his legacy lives on as the man who marched from Greece to the edges of India, undefeated and unforgettable. At the Battle of Granicus in 334 BCE, Alexander the Great faced his first true test as the new ruler of Macedon and commander of an ambitious campaign into Asia. Barely 22 years old, he led his men across the Hellespont into Persian territory, determined to strike at the heart of the world's most powerful empire. The Persians, aware of his advance, gathered a formidable force along the banks of the Granicus River in Asia Minor, ready to halt what they saw as a reckless invasion by a young and inexperienced king. Yet what followed proved that Alexander was not only prepared for war, but destined to change history. The Persian army, made up of cavalry and mercenaries, positioned themselves on the far side of the river, confident that the swollen waters and steep banks would protect them. The terrain seemed to favor the defenders, and Persian commanders believed that Alexander would hesitate before making a direct assault. The very idea of forcing a river crossing under enemy fire was a gamble few generals would dare attempt. But Alexander was not like other generals. He knew that hesitation could embolden the Persians and weaken the confidence of his own men. So instead of waiting, he decided to attack immediately, using speed and audacity as his greatest weapons. As dawn broke, Alexander arranged his forces with precision. His phalanx, armed with long spears called sarissas, formed the backbone of his line, while cavalry units were positioned on the flanks. He placed himself at the head of his companion cavalry on the right wing, a signal to his men that their king would lead from the front, sharing both the dangers and the glory. His generals, including the experienced Parmenion, urged caution, warning of the risks of charging across a river against a fortified enemy. Alexander, however, dismissed hesitation. He believed that boldness in the face of danger was the path to victory, and his men, inspired by his confidence, were ready to follow. The battle began with a diversion. Alexander sent light cavalry to probe the Persian line and draw their attention. As the Persians shifted to meet this threat, Alexander made his move. Leading the companion cavalry, he plunged directly into the river, water rushing against the legs of men and horses. Arrows and javelins rained down from the enemy, but Alexander pressed forward. Emerging from the water onto the muddy bank, he and his cavalry smashed into the Persian horsemen with the full weight of their charge. The fighting was fierce and chaotic. Persian nobles rode out to challenge Alexander himself, hoping to cut down the young king and end the invasion before it truly began. In the melee, Alexander's helmet was struck and his life was nearly taken. But his skill and courage carried him through. He struck down his attackers one after another, his presence on the battlefield inspiring his men to fight with renewed ferocity. The Macedonian cavalry, trained to fight as a disciplined wedge, broke through the Persian line, creating disorder and panic. Meanwhile, the Macedonian phalanx advanced steadily across the river, their long spears forming an impenetrable wall that pushed back the Persian infantry. Step by step, they secured the crossing, turning what had seemed an impossible assault into a relentless advance. As the Persians faltered, the balance shifted. What began as a bold gamble turned into a crushing success. The Persians soon broke ranks, their cavalry scattered, and their infantry cut down. Many of the mercenaries who had fought for Persian gold tried to surrender, but Alexander gave no quarter to those who had stood against him. The battlefield was littered with bodies, the river itself stained red with blood. In a single day, Alexander had achieved not only a military victory but a psychological one. The myth of Persian invincibility was shattered, and the legend of Alexander's genius was born. The aftermath of Granicus was profound. Chosile, Asia Minor, once under the control of Persian satraps, began to open its gates to the Macedonian king. Cities that once feared Persia now turned to Alexander, seeing in him a leader who could not be stopped. His men, many of whom had doubted their young commander, now saw with their own eyes that he was fearless, decisive, and destined to lead them to greater conquests. The Battle of Granicus was more than just a military triumph. It was the moment Alexander announced himself to the world as a commander unlike any other. By defying the odds and seizing victory through courage, strategy, and personal valor, he secured the first step in a campaign that would carry him across continents. Granicus was the spark, and from that spark blazed the fire of conquest that would burn until the very edges of the known world were within his grasp. The Battle of Hydaspes in 333 BCE was the second great test for Alexander the Great, and it proved once more that his victories were no accident of fortune, but the product of daring vision and tactical brilliance. Unlike the confrontation at Granicus, this time he faced the Persian king himself. Darius III, ruler of the largest empire the world had ever seen, marched out with an army far larger than Alexander's, determined to crush the Macedonian invasion before it could advance deeper into his realm. The stage was set for a clash that would decide the fate of Asia Minor and test whether Alexander could truly stand against the might of Persia. The battlefield was narrow, hemmed in by mountains on one side and the sea on the other. This geography would prove decisive. Darius had intended to use his vast numbers to envelop Alexander, but in the cramped plain near the river Pinarus, the sheer size of his army became more a burden than an advantage. The Persians still outnumbered the Macedonians, but their strength was constrained, while Alexander's smaller, disciplined force could move with precision. Darius positioned himself in the center of his line, surrounded by elite troops, a symbol of power and confidence. His cavalry lined the flanks, and his Greek mercenaries, hardened fighters hired with Persian gold, stood ready to clash with Alexander's phalanx. For many, the sight of Darius, resplendent in royal armor, at the head of a massive host was enough to inspire awe. But Alexander saw not a godlike king, only a man who could be broken. As the armies closed, Alexander placed his trust once again in the tactics that had carried him through Granicus. On the right wing, at the head of his companion cavalry, he prepared to strike directly toward Darius himself. This was no accident. Alexander believed that battles were won not only by breaking lines, but by breaking hearts. If the Persian king could be made to flee, the will of the entire army would collapse with him. The clash began with skirmishes across the river. Persian archers and slingers sent volleys of missiles into the Macedonian ranks, while cavalry fought along the flanks. The fighting was brutal, but the Macedonian phalanx advanced steadily, their long sarissas pushing back the mercenaries who tried to hold the line. At the same time, Alexander made his move. Leading his cavalry wedge, he drove across the river and slammed into the Persian left. The charge was thunderous, a spearhead of horsemen breaking into the enemy ranks with unstoppable force. In the chaos, Alexander cut his way through toward the Persian center. His eyes were fixed on Darius, who stood on his chariot commanding the battle. The sight of the young king charging directly at him sent a wave of panic through the Persian line. Alexander's companions fought like men possessed, forcing a gap wider and wider through the mass of troops. When the moment of crisis came, Darius lost his nerve. Fear overcame pride, and he turned his chariot to flee. What followed was inevitable. The Persian army, seeing their king abandon the field, broke apart. Panic spread faster than any command could contain. Soldiers who had stood firm moments earlier now ran for their lives, casting aside weapons in the mad rush to escape. The Macedonians pursued, cutting down countless men as the battlefield turned into a slaughter. In the aftermath, the cost to Persia was devastating. Darius left behind not only his army, but also his royal family, who fell into Alexander's hands. His wife, daughters, and mother were captured, but Alexander treated them with respect, a gesture that elevated his image as both conqueror and magnanimous king. For his men, the victory was proof that their young leader was destined for greatness. For the Persians, it was a humiliation unlike any they had ever known. The victory at Issus was more than just a battle won. It was a statement to the world. Alexander was not simply a raider or invader. He was a force that could challenge and defeat the most powerful monarch alive. With the Persian king himself fleeing in terror, the myth of Persian invincibility was shattered forever. Cities and territories began to open their gates to Alexander, no longer willing to resist a man who could unseat kings. Issus also marked the point at which Alexander's reputation soared beyond Greece and Asia Minor. Stories of his courage, his leadership from the front, and his unstoppable cavalry charge spread across the known world. The image of Darius fleeing before him would become the symbol of a crumbling empire, while Alexander stood as the embodiment of destiny. For the Macedonian king, the battle was proof of his philosophy of war. Victory did not belong to the largest army, nor to the strongest defenses. It belonged to the leader who could strike decisively at the enemy's heart, break their will, and seize the moment when chaos turned into collapse. At Issus, Alexander had shown that he could do all these things with unmatched brilliance. The Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BCE stands as the greatest triumph of Alexander the Great's career, a clash that not only broke the Persian Empire, but also cemented his place among history's most brilliant commanders. This was not a minor skirmish or a test of daring. It was a showdown against the full strength of Darius III, who gathered an army of colossal size, determined to crush the invader once and for all. The scale of the confrontation was so vast that it has echoed through time as the ultimate example of how strategy can overcome overwhelming numbers. Darius chose the plains of Gaugamela, near modern-day Iraq, as the battlefield, because he ordered the ground leveled and cleared to make it suitable for his scythed chariots, fearsome weapons designed to slice through infantry lines. His army stretched across the horizon, infantry, cavalry, war chariots, and even elephants, drawn from the farthest reaches of the empire. Ancient accounts speak of hundreds of thousands of Persians, though the true number was likely smaller. Still, they outnumbered Alexander's 47,000 men several times over. Against such odds, most generals would have hesitated, perhaps even withdrawn. Alexander instead saw an opportunity to deliver a decisive blow that would end the Persian threat forever. On the night before the battle, his generals urged him to launch a surprise attack under cover of darkness, but Alexander refused. He wanted the world to see him defeat Darius in broad daylight, without trickery or ambush. Confidence radiated from him, and his men drew strength from it. He believed that discipline, innovation, and the will to seize the decisive moment would overcome any numerical disadvantage. At dawn, the two armies faced each other. Alexander placed his companion cavalry on the right wing under his direct command, with the phalanx forming the center and Parmenion leading the left. Behind them stood reserves ready to respond to any breakthroughs. Darius, standing tall on a high chariot, commanded from the heart of his army, surrounded by his elite guard. The Persian lines dwarfed the Macedonians, but Alexander's formation was flexible and calculated. The battle began with Persian chariots charging forward, scythes flashing as horses thundered toward the Macedonian lines. But Alexander had anticipated this. His men opened their ranks at the last moment, allowing the chariots to pass harmlessly through, where they were cut down by light infantry waiting behind. The terrifying weapon that Darius had hoped would shatter morale failed before it even began. Next came the cavalry clashes on the flanks. The Persians pressed hard, hoping to envelop Alexander's smaller force. On the Macedonian left, Parmenion struggled under the weight of enemy numbers, but he held firm. Meanwhile, Alexander advanced slowly on the right, drawing Persian forces toward him. It was a deliberate move, stretching the Persian line thin and creating a gap in their formation. Then came the decisive stroke. Seizing the moment, Alexander wheeled his cavalry inward, forming a wedge that drove straight at the gap in the Persian line. With precision and ferocity, he aimed directly for Darius himself. The sight of the Macedonian king charging headlong toward the Persian monarch threw the enemy into chaos. Once again, Darius lost his nerve. Terrified of being captured or killed, he abandoned his chariot and fled the field, leaving his vast army leaderless. The effect was immediate and devastating. Panic swept through the Persian ranks, turning their numerical superiority into a disorganized rout. The Macedonian phalanx pressed forward, cutting down fleeing soldiers, while the cavalry pursued relentlessly. The battlefield, once filled with the roar of armies, now echoed with the cries of the defeated and the thunder of pursuit. The victory at Gaugamela was absolute. The Persian Empire, centuries old and the greatest political power of its time, crumbled in a single day. Alexander captured the royal treasure and marched unopposed into Babylon, the jewel of the East. From there, the road to Persepolis and the heart of Persia lay open. With one battle, Alexander had transformed himself from invader to ruler of Asia. Yet Gaugamela was more than a conquest of land. It was a conquest of fear. Alexander had proven that discipline, courage, and tactical brilliance could shatter even the mightiest empire. His men, though exhausted, believed now that no force on earth could stop them. The Persians, once lords of half the known world, were left broken, their king fleeing, their empire collapsing. For Alexander, the triumph was not just military, it was symbolic. He had taken on the greatest power of the ancient world and destroyed it in open battle. The legend of Gaugamela spread across continents, a story of a young king who stood against impossible odds and emerged undefeated. From that moment forward, Alexander was no longer simply the king of Macedon. He was the master of Asia, destined to carve an empire that stretched from Greece to the edges of India. The siege of Tyre in 332 BCE was one of Alexander the Great's most audacious and relentless campaigns. A battle not of open fields and cavalry charges, but of patience, engineering, and unbreakable will. Unlike Granicus, Isis, or even Gaugamela, where Alexander's brilliance was revealed through maneuvers and bold strikes, Tyre tested a different side of his genius, his ability to achieve the impossible against a fortress city protected not only by walls, but by the sea itself. Tyre was no ordinary city. Perched on an island half a mile off the coast of Phoenicia, it was surrounded by powerful stone walls that rose nearly 150 feet from the waves. Its harbors were filled with ships, and its defenders were skilled sailors and warriors. For centuries, Tyre had been a jewel of the Mediterranean, wealthy, independent, and secure. When Alexander advanced down the Levant after his victories against Persia, most cities submitted to him without resistance. But Tyre refused. Confident in their natural defenses, the Tyrians declared they would never allow Alexander to enter. For most conquerors, such defiance from an island fortress might have been ignored, bypassed in favor of easier conquests. But Alexander could not allow it. Tyre's strategic location controlled trade and naval power in the region, and leaving it unconquered would mean leaving an enemy stronghold at his back. More than that, Alexander's pride demanded submission. He declared that Tyre would fall, no matter how long it took. At first glance, the challenge seemed insurmountable. How could an army without a strong navy take an island city defended by towering walls? Alexander answered with a plan as bold as it was unthinkable. He would build a causeway, a massive land bridge stretching from the mainland to the island. With this, he could bring his siege engines and towers right up to the city walls. The task was monumental. His men began hauling stones, timber, and rubble into the sea, slowly extending the causeway under constant harassment from Tyrian ships. The Tyrians did not sit idle. They launched raids against the workers, showered them with missiles, and used their fleet to attack from the sea. At one point, they set fire to Alexander's siege towers, destroying weeks of work in a single blaze. Yet Alexander did not falter. He ordered new towers built, larger and stronger than before, protected with hides soaked in water to resist fire. His determination drove his men to keep pushing stone after stone until the causeway inched closer to the city. Realizing that land alone would not bring Tyre down, Alexander also built up a fleet. He captured ships from conquered Phoenician ports and assembled an armada that could challenge Tyre on the water. With both land and sea forces pressing the attack, the balance began to shift. Alexander's engineers constructed massive siege engines, battering rams, catapults, and towering structures that loomed nearly as high as Tyre's walls. From these machines, his soldiers hurled projectiles and stormed the battlements. The final assault came after months of relentless effort. Alexander's fleet blockaded the city, cutting off supplies while the causeway brought his engines within striking distance. His catapults hammered the walls day and night until cracks appeared in the stone. Then at last, Macedonian soldiers swarmed through the breaches, climbing ladders and storming the defenses. Fighting raged across the city, house to house, as the Tyrians resisted with desperate courage. But they could not withstand the onslaught forever. After 7 grueling months, Tyre fell. The aftermath was brutal. Alexander, enraged by the long resistance, allowed his soldiers to sack the city. Thousands were killed, and many more were sold into slavery. Yet the victory was absolute. The island fortress, once thought impregnable, had been broken by sheer persistence and ingenuity. The causeway Alexander built remained for centuries, slowly turning Tyre into a peninsula, a permanent reminder of his conquest. The siege of Tyre demonstrated a different kind of brilliance than Alexander's earlier battles. At Granicus, Hydaspes, and Gaugamela, victory had come through bold maneuvers and decisive strikes. At Tyre, it came through engineering, endurance, and unyielding determination. Alexander showed that no obstacle, whether natural or man-made, could stand in the way of his ambition. He had bent rivers and mountains to his will, and now he had conquered the sea itself. For his men, the victory reinforced the belief that their king could overcome any challenge, no matter how impossible it seemed. For the world, it sent a message that resistance to Alexander was not only futile but catastrophic. Tyre had defied him, and Tyre had been erased. With the fall of Tyre, Alexander secured control of the eastern Mediterranean and ensured his rear was safe for the march deeper into Persia. It was not just a strategic victory, but a symbol of his unstoppable drive. Where others saw barriers, Alexander saw opportunities. And at Tyre, he proved that even the strongest walls could not keep him out. The Battle of Hydaspes in 326 BCE was unlike any conflict Alexander the Great had ever faced. After defeating the Persians and extending his empire deep into Asia, he pushed beyond the known world to the Indus Valley. There, on the banks of the Hydaspes River, today's Jhelum in modern Pakistan, he confronted King Porus, a ruler whose army possessed something the Macedonians had never encountered on such a scale: war, elephants. The sight of these massive beasts towering above men and horses struck fear even into seasoned soldiers. Yet Alexander, undefeated in every campaign, approached this challenge with the same blend of caution, strategy, and audacity that had carried him across continents. Porus was no ordinary opponent. He was a proud and experienced warrior, determined to defend his kingdom against the foreign invader. His army included cavalry, infantry, chariots, and over 200 elephants, their tusks tipped with iron. Their sheer size intended to terrify and trample any who stood against them. He took position on the far bank of the river, confident that its raging waters would keep Alexander at bay. Crossing an army through a swollen river in the face of an enemy was considered nearly impossible. Porus believed he could wait Alexander out, but Alexander was a master of the unexpected. Instead of rushing into a direct crossing, he set about deceiving his opponent. For days, he moved his troops up and down the riverbank, making feints and false preparations as if to cross at different points. Porus, wary of a trick, shadowed him but remained uncertain of where the attack would come. Then, on a stormy night, Alexander seized his chance. Under cover of darkness and rain, he led a portion of his army upriver, found a ford, and crossed with cavalry and select infantry. When dawn broke, he had already outflanked Porus. Porus quickly turned to meet the threat. He deployed his elephants in a line at the front of his army, placing infantry between them with cavalry on the wings. It was an intimidating sight, a living wall of giants ready to charge. Alexander, however, did not panic. He positioned his own cavalry on the flanks and ordered his archers and light infantry to target the elephants and their riders. The battle began with furious cavalry clashes. Alexander launched his horsemen against Porus's left flank, drawing the Indian cavalry into combat. At the same time, he sent his hidden reserves to strike at Porus's right, dividing his attention. With the Indian cavalry drawn away, Alexander's phalanx advanced cautiously against the line of elephants. The clash that followed was brutal beyond anything the Macedonians had seen. Elephants stormed into the phalanx, their tusks impaling men, their trunks hurling soldiers through the air. Horses panicked at their scent, and the ground shook beneath their weight. Yet the Macedonian discipline held. Sarissas thrust upward into the bellies of the beasts while archers rained arrows upon them. Slowly, the elephants began to panic, trampling friend and foe alike as confusion spread through Porus's ranks. Alexander pressed his advantage. His cavalry, having scattered the Indian horsemen, now circled back to attack from the rear. The Macedonian infantry pushed forward relentlessly, exploiting every gap as the elephants faltered. Surrounded and overwhelmed, Porus's army broke apart. Thousands were slain, and the once mighty line of elephants turned the battlefield into chaos as they rampaged uncontrollably. Despite the devastation, Porus himself fought with extraordinary courage. Mounted on his elephant, he resisted to the very end, refusing to flee even as his army collapsed around him. Wounded and exhausted, he was finally captured and brought before Alexander. When asked how he wished to be treated, Porus is said to have replied, like a king, impressed by his bravery and dignity. Alexander not only spared him but allowed him to continue ruling his kingdom as a satrap under Macedonian authority. The Battle of Hydaspes was more than just another victory for Alexander. It was proof of his adaptability and the resilience of his army. He had faced a new form of warfare, terrifying and alien, and turned it into yet another triumph. For his soldiers, however, the battle marked a turning point. Exhausted by years of campaigning and shaken by the scale of the struggle, many began to question how much further they could march into unknown lands. Strategically, Hydaspes secured Alexander's control over the Punjab and extended his influence into India. Symbolically, it showed the world that not even elephants, the living tanks of ancient warfare, could stop him. Yet it also revealed the limits of conquest. His men, weary of endless battles and longing for home, refused to march further east toward the Ganges. The battle that had showcased Alexander's genius also marked the beginning of the end of his relentless expansion. Still, the Hydaspes stands as one of his greatest achievements. Against overwhelming odds, facing an enemy who used weapons he had never seen before, Alexander remained undefeated. He had crossed the river, broken the elephants, humbled a mighty king, and shown once more that no challenge was too great. His legend, already vast, now stretched to the edges of the world. From the banks of the Granicus to the plains of Issus, from the vast field of Gaugamela to the walls of Tyre, and finally to the distant Hydaspes, Alexander proved time and again that no force, no fortress, and no foe could halt his advance. His genius lay not only in strategy but in his unshakable will, his ability to inspire men to attempt the impossible and emerge victorious. Though his life was short, his record was flawless. He never lost a battle. In his relentless march across the world, Alexander carved an empire and a legacy that outlived him, shaping history itself and ensuring his name would echo through the ages as the undefeated conqueror.